Hello, and welcome to the Master Voices podcast, where we invite a diverse range of masterful voices to explore subjects ranging from music and language to history and culture. This pod is a project of the New York City nonprofit Master Voices, formerly known as the Collegiate Chorale, which then, as now, is dedicated to the unique power of the human voice to connect, unite, and inspire. In the next 3 episodes, linguist, New York Times writer, and Gershwin enthusiast John McWhorter delves into the world of the Gershwin and Kaufman musical Strike Up the Band. You'll hear from theater historian Lawrence Maslan, New Yorker cartoonist and editor Bob Mankoff, maestro John McWhorter, and Master Voice's own maestro and artistic director Ted Sperling, as they unpack the many unique facets of the wholly unique Strike Up the Band. And now, without further ado, sit back and enjoy the Master Voices podcast.
Greetings, all. I am John McWhorter, and we're going to talk about the 1927/1930 musical Strike Up the Band, which will be given a wonderful performance by Master Voices on October 29th. And today's podcast is going to be about Strike Up the Band in the context of satire, specifically satire in the 1920s and 1930s, which was a more novel element in American humor at the time than we might think today in what is often called the age of irony. And to talk about that, given that I'm not sure I know what satire is, yes, I'm being coy, is Bob Mankoff, who I'm sure all of you know, even if you think you don't know, as the New Yorker magazine cartoonist and the editor of New Yorker magazine cartoons for a good 20 years. He has edited many volumes, and that's just the beginning of his oeuvre. But Bob does know what satire is. And I just want to open up by saying that as we engage Strike Up the Band, we have to remember that when we're going back this far, it's basically 100 years, a Broadway musical in 1927 was, by our standards, piffle, really. And I say that as a great aficionado of the form. I would give at least half of my earnings to spend a week in, say, 1925 and go to the theater coughing in the cigarette smoke just to see what these things were like. But basically, musical theater meant that you had about 14 songs. The songs were usually either about love, dancing, or something of the sort, rarely anything very specific. And a script was written that just got you from song to song. There was a love couple, then there was another, usually younger love couple who did a couple of numbers dancing in front of the curtain while they changed the set. And that was pretty much it. Most of the shows are completely forgotten, justifiably, because that's all they were. And even the shows by the big boys like George Gershwin and Irving Berlin really didn't get past that level. Here we are in 1927, and after several musicals like that, the best of their form, just like there are very good hot dogs and bad ones. This is like the Hebrew National of musicals in many ways. They did many of those. Then they get to 1927, they want to try something different, and they actually try to do American Gilbert and Sullivan. And it's the beginning of a trio of satirical musicals that the two of them did. There were Of the I Sing and Let Him Eat Cake, which was a sequel of that one. But before them was Strike Up the Band. And here Master Voices gets to strike up the band, having already done Of the I Sing and Let Him Eat Cake. And Bob, I want to ask you first, before we get a little more specific with this fascinating property, what's satire?
Well, satire is sort of a shapeshifter. It takes over many different forms. You know, if you go back to The Rape of the Lock, which I will not go back to because it would be just too tedious to read. It could be it could be a poem that ridicules. You could go back, which I am a little bit more interested in, to Greek comedy, old Greek comedy, Aristophanes, where it's entertaining ridicule, and it's ridicule with some sort of purpose, some sort of intent. Now, the intent could be, it's got a moral point of view between good and bad, and it's going to situate saying, this is bad, not really saying what's good, but this is bad. And we're going to make a lot of fun of it. You know, Aristophanes makes fun of all people, Socrates. You know, Socrates is there in the thinkery. He's basically teaching the young how to think their way out of anything, bills they owe or whatever. And, in the play, it doesn't end well, for, Socrates. So satire has a moral intent. It's supposed to laugh folly out of existence. It hasn't seemed to be very successful at that, right? But when we say that when I say it's a shapeshifter, it can take the form of a Tom Lehrer song, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
mm-hmm.
so long, Mom. I'm off to drop the bomb. It can take the form of a broadcast, Saturday Night Live, right? It can be Jon Stewart, who is giving us the news, or John Oliver. So it's in many, many different forms. And my view of it is that it has zero, in terms of its ability to reform or change minds, it has zero effect.
So it's basically an entertainment. But would you say, actually, that today satire has become a default kind of humor, that we as Americans, if we're going to be made to laugh, we're going to expect that there is a satirical element. And if there isn't, then especially the more, quote unquote, enlightened among us think of it as, somewhat backwards. We expect the satire. For example, Saturday Night Live is now default American humor, not the edgy thing that it was even in 1975. Would you say that that might be the case?
I think satire is a way to show that you're smart and funny.
Right.
That you know something. It's about the events of the world. Okay. Mm-hmm. It seems to make a comment about them. I mean, even in, when we're looking back to Strike Up the Band and, the outrage of Fletcher that Switzerland is objecting to the tariff based on, they can't do that. It's the Monroe Doctrine, right? Well, even then, you have to know something. Right. And a little bit about, that's by George Madison, right? So it's not George Madison,
right.
James Madison.
Exactly.
But satire demands very superficial knowledge. That's how it works.
Okay. There's actually a passage in Strike Up the Band in the 1927 version that actually makes me laugh. And it's the kind of satire you mean where you're supposed to be in on the joke. And so in 1927, New Yorkers would have been familiar with a policy where city kids were sent to spend, say, the summer in the country, the idea being that it was purer in the country. But Mrs. Draper, our kind of Margaret Dumont dowager, is thinking of something just in the reverse. She has no idea. I'm going to imitate her in a way that's going to be extremely annoying, but this is a very brief passage in it. But Mrs. Draper, the dowager, says, "Mercy, Mr. Fletcher, have you ever stopped to think of our children?" And Fletcher says, "I beg your pardon? When I say our children, I, of course, mean merely children." "Oh." And then Mrs. Draper says, "And particularly, Mr. Fletcher, those poor children who are doomed to spend their childhood out in the country. That's why I'm starting the City Air movement for country children. I feel that for the sake of its health, every country child should have 2 weeks a year in the city." That's something that presumes that you know about the policy in question. And so that's Strike Up the Band considering itself satire, I would think. But yeah.
I should say for this morning's performance, John will be playing the part of Miss Draper. I will be playing the part of Elvin. Okay.
There's a part of me that wants to be her. I'm not sure why.
And actually, that's a joke. Okay, that's a joke. It's a switcheroo, right? You can imagine that as a skit. It's not real. It's not real. It's not really a bad idea. And you could see that in a completely different kind of joke, in a cynical way. It's more like I would think about it in that, I don't like to go outside. I'm an indoorsman.
So am I.
I don't like to travel. When people ask me for travel advice, I say, don't go.
I don't want to admit that I'm kind of the similar. Yeah.
Okay. So this kind of Kaufman-esque ideas I think you see in that. I think that satire is ultimately a kind of clever cynicism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And cynicism always seems smart. This is the way the world really works. We're revealing, we're revealing something here. But I do think it edges over now. One of the things is that when I look at humor over the course of the New Yorker, or even historically, which I'm interested in, just like music, it's constantly evolving form that always has strength. So it starts off as, okay, it's satire. It sort of looks like satire. Then it just becomes irony, a kind of detachment. It's unmoored from any moralistic idea that the world should change, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's saying we're wised up to it, and
Right.
we're wised up to it, and we're at a distance from it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think part of that comes out of the realization, as I wrote, is that clearly, absolutely, it is not going to change the world.
Right. Right.
It's hard enough to change the world in any other way. We think we can change the world.
Right.
The idea that you're going to listen to Jon Stewart and somehow, or this whole idea of speaking truth to power, power never picks up that call.
Right. And that's something that it can be hard to realize even with the passage of time. But that actually leads to another question. It's 1927. And, everybody's smoking, everybody's going to die of blood pressure. And, they're at 59, there's a very different world. There's no penicillin. Movies are silent. How did satire fit into the culture then? Like, for example, do you think that Kaufman, in writing his satirical book to this, and not to mention the straight plays that he had hits with, did he think he was going to change the world? Was it a time when that was a fresher idea, or did he already know that he was just having a good time? And in general, satire in 1927.
I think I think I'll get back to Kaufman in a minute, but I don't think anybody on Saturday Night Live is a satirist. They're a performer.
Mm-hmm.
Satire is
what about the writers?
Even the writers. Once you could really be funny for money, could really be funny for money, that changed the equation. And that starts with vaudeville. And vaudeville is the first, of course, it's comedy before then, but getting rich at comedy for a lot of people.
There was no such thing.
Right. Okay, no, but vaudeville, it starts to happen. It's a
exactly
medium. For the first time, you have something called material. Okay, there's material. Okay, that's written for you. It's a commodity. See, now it's changed in terms of how we think people are funny. But then you buy material, you buy jokes. Okay, and maybe you want to buy satire. And Saturday Night Live becomes a satire. Does that mean that Lorne Michaels, what his opinions are about the world? You can use it as a mode. You can use it as a performance. So I think it becomes a default way of being smart, but more importantly, it becomes a way of making money. Now, I would say with someone like John Oliver, it's different. You're looking at someone who has a moral point of view. And it's interesting when he does his satire, it's mostly not satire. It's mostly actually didactic with performance.
Commentary.
Performance.
There's actually an interesting kind of nexus, though, between vaudeville, which is people throwing their hats around, a lot of kicking each other in the butts. Vaudeville was about kicking each other in the behind and all of the broad physical humor. And then the satire that starts coming in the 20s. And in fact, we have discussed a peculiar and crucial book. What's it called? Why are pistachio? What makes pistachio nuts?
What made pistachio?
What made pistachio nuts?
No one can see it.
There it goes.
It is, which is wonderful.
It's this peculiar book from about 30 years ago, but it still has wonderful insights where it basically demonstrates how vaudeville shaded into what we now see as satire, right?
Vaudeville where vaudeville had started to have an influence on theater and movies, and there were two very different aesthetics. And the aesthetic of vaudeville was, I just watched the clip on YouTube of Donald O'Connor with "Make 'Em Laugh," "Make 'Em Laugh," make a genius bit.
Yeah.
And which is the audience is right there. You're not waiting till the curtain for them to laugh. You're interacting with them immediately. That, I think, shifts over in that I don't think the legitimate theater at one time and vaudeville thought of themselves as very separate, but these audiences were going to both.
Right.
And they were expecting both. So these bits in Strike Up the Band, where you essentially have performance, and that also you see in all.
You mean in Strike Up the Band, where you have the comedy team of Bobby Clark and Paul McCullough, and a lot of what they do when they come out is shtick that they didn't even see the need to write down in the script because everybody knew the sort of stuff that they did, and that was part of a Broadway musical, and maybe changed from night to night. Yeah.
And that's what people were expecting in the original, which closed. And I originally, probably shouldn't say this, when I originally read the script, I said maybe it closed on Saturday night because it stunk. But now that I've read it 3 or more times, and actually understand that I think Kaufman was in some sense right, because they were not ready.
When Kaufman said that satire is what closes on Saturday night, and that was in reference to Strike Up the Band's first incarnation closing in Philadelphia, right?
But get back to your point, I don't think in the end he's a real satirist. I don't think that's his initial...
Kaufman.
I don't think that's his grounding. He wants to entertain. He has all these musicals before that. Now, anybody who's comic and intelligent eventually thinks they might have something to say beyond that. That's an enormous mistake, I think.
You mean that they should just stick with
they should stay really
the jolly vein that they
I'm not
started.
actually interested in Jon Stewart's opinions. I mean, if he's a smart guy, right? But you see, whenever you actually go from your satire to what you say, you actually have to make an argument that will convince someone. A joke is never an argument, and I think where satire, first of all, satire is fun. Humor is its own reason for existence, just like music. I don't have to justify it. But it does conceivably open up the discussion. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think the reason it's used now is knowing where people said most people get their news through Jon Stewart is because otherwise it's boring. So he makes it not boring, and you get the information that way, such as it is.
It's interesting with Strike Up the Band and satire, because I find that it's a fascinating look at how these things evolve. And so here it is as a piece of satire. And what's interesting is that in the Pistachio book, one of my favorite pages is where they discuss how in these goofy, early talky, satirical films, quote unquote comedies with Wheeler and Woolsey and people like that. When they were making them, they didn't think of them as satire. They knew they were kind of about politics or something, but they thought they were just doing the same old thing. And I think satire in the culture ends up entrenching itself gradually. And what was really hot then, smart then, can't help but be less now. In the same ways, during the pandemic, I thought I ended up watching every episode of The Jeffersons. It almost hurt by the end of it. I thought I was going to do it with Get Smart, because everybody says, oh, Get Smart. And I was a little too young to really watch it. I found Get Smart is a great little show, but Airplane did it better, and
Yeah.
Saturday Night Live now does it better, and 30 Rock does it better. That was the state of the art then. But nevertheless, there are things in Strike Up the Band where I genuinely laugh. I'm going to read one more passage.
Yeah, sure.
And don't worry, neither one of these people are a woman, so it's not going to be so stupid. But this
Okay.
is Fletcher, and he's the, and then he has this younger assistant, and the younger assistant is
Sloan, right?
discussing with him, Sloan, right, how things are going. And so Sloan says, I have some of the reports here from the Middle West, if you care to hear them. There was a very large celebration in Des Moines, Iowa, a big cheese town. The parade was led by two naked girls, symbolizing law and order, and was followed by the entire male population of the city. That shows how popular the cheese is. That's
okay,
funny.
see, I read it.
Yeah, I think that is genuinely funny, and it is
all
a kind
of that, you're right. I like the way it starts with jokes. There are lots. There's lots of jokes. Then he talks about the the record for cheese, that it's 8.5 pounds, no bread. No bread, but not a record, And every time I think of it, I say, hey, that's interesting. That's the 20s. In the 20s, people are, sitting on flagpoles. But
this man is going to start a war, which I think is hilarious.
This man is going to start a war. And there are, I guess one of the things is that satire now is often self-knowing. So here you have the situational irony. None of these people think they're making jokes.
I know what you mean. Right.
None of these things. And that also relates to how humor evolved in the New Yorker magazine. If you look in the 30s and 40s, we're viewing a scene. We're seeing a baseball game from 1947, and a woman is looking at her watch and she's saying, why didn't they tell us there would be an extra inning? She is not making a joke. And 20 or 30 or 40 years later, a woman is saying, I started my vegetarianisms for moral reasons, then health concerns, now just to annoy people. She is making a joke. The cartoons now are often influenced by people growing up with sitcoms, up with which people within the frame are making the joke. We're not looking into it. And so in the same way here, but it's different here. And that also goes back to that book, because the vaudeville aesthetic is you're getting the laugh from the audience. The theatrical aesthetic is you're waiting till the end. Okay. But Kaufman is playing it both ways. He's starting off funny. He's starting off giving us some jokes that I think the people would be laughing at. Right.
Now, of course, in Duck Soup, if we're talking about satire in this era, they know that they're making jokes. And I think that's part of why it's so ahead of the curve. You can sometimes it's hard to believe that Duck Soup was as early as it was. They know, right?
Well, Groucho knows, because he's Groucho. And that's what, when Groucho is talking to Dumont, he is rattling off a series of his performance jokes. I don't think it's like some precursor. I think it's that's vaudeville. Vaudeville is I'm going to do my rapid fire jokes. You're going to stand there, and then like the crazy.
That's interesting.
Just like here, where all of a sudden take a card. Any card.
It's almost as if bringing that vaudeville style of performance and presentation into a narrative book becomes satire, because you're supposed to at least be pretending something real is going on, and instead, Harpo's, leaving his leg in people's arms, and Groucho saying,
Harpo would be the clearest example of vaudeville. It almost has. And I must say, growing up, I loved the Marx Brothers. Marx Brothers made me laugh. They don't now. That's just the way it is. And I do think that I have a sort of jaundiced eye about a lot of the things we revere, or that it's just maybe there's so much luck or happenstance, the Marx Brothers rather than the Rich Brothers. And retrospectively, we say, well, oh, it must have been. Shakespeare must have been so much better. I mean, there's a great New Yorker cartoon where a guy is saying, I like everything Shakespearean, just so long as it's not Shakespeare.
Right. The Ritz brothers, I'm glad you brought them up because it helps me to clarify. When I say that the Marx Brothers knockabout stuff becomes satire, I mean that in bringing that into a story, like they're doing that in a mansion with Margaret Dumont, who doesn't know she's making jokes, just standing there.
Right.
That means that they are shaking their fists in a way against the common order. Now, in vaudeville, they were just doing stuff. But if that's in a mansion on Long Island, then in a way, they're making a comment in a way that the Ritz brothers, and for those of you who by some chance might not know who they were just shitty Marx Brothers. There was these guys that happened to get a good contract at 20th Century Fox, and the action would stop and they'd come out and do some dumb stuff.
Yeah.
And that was what the Marx Brothers were better than, because they were always kind of in quotation marks. And so that's what I mean by it was proto satire. Go ahead.
Who are the Marx Brothers? I mean, a friend of mine, Steve Camper, wrote a whole bio of them. Who are they?
I knew Steve.
Oh, they're not very educated. They're brilliant performers, and they're coming out of vaudeville. They intersect somehow with an intellectual environment that puts this frame on them.
Yeah.
That somehow the T.S. Eliot wants to talk to them, and we put a frame on it because we analyze it, that they're anarchic, that they were against the social order, that they were this and that. I don't think they were. I think they were vaudeville performers who were intelligent, and this is something I think that Groucho is smart. You can see in the letters that he's written and stuff. And
You Bet Your Life and his interviews.
Yeah, he's smart and he's clever. I think one of the things that changed about satire, even from Kaufman. Now, Kaufman is certainly smart, but he's not really educated either, right? He doesn't go.
Not in the modern sense.
Not in the current thing. All of our satirists now went to the top schools. Okay, that's how it changed in a way, that you had people who actually had
Harvard, Lampoon,
lots of an education, Brown, Harvard, Princeton. They start to infiltrate comedy. And I think, and not only that, when we're looking at Kaufman, okay, he is collaborating, right? Who is John Oliver collaborating with? He's got a whole team. Okay, so we're able to bring what I'm saying, a lot of smart people who went through the educational system in this to make a really a different quality kind of joke. I think it's in some way it's sterilized because it's commercialized, but in some way it's also clearly of higher quality. When you see Colin Jost and these people, they've got a team behind them creating this stuff.
You're making me think, Bob, because this is something I've never admitted in public because I thought it meant that I'm not intelligent. The Marx Brothers have never done a thing for me either. I find them historically interesting. I've seen all the films, but maybe 1.5 of them. I think I've read 2 books about them because I find them fascinating, including one that really just takes them all from infancy, practically, records when they went to the bathroom to the end. I forget the title. They're very interesting figures, but I've never found them funny at all. And I always thought I wasn't finding them funny because I found their battle against current realities and their battle against the man witless. I always thought I get where they're going, but frankly, they're not doing it in a way I find very interesting. You're saying that really it's just that I don't find knockabout vaudeville from 110 years ago funny, and who does?
And 100 years from now, people are not humor's a wear that does not last very well. I mean, I've given talks sometimes, and I've said, someone will say, but this is humorous in Plato's dialogue. I said, really? Come on.
Not really. Yeah.
I mean, not really, or
You're,
Shakespeare for that matter.
no,
I
you're only
mean,
laughing in quotation marks. Yeah.
you're laughing in quotation marks at it, and the when I have done these various anthologies, I'm eliminating a lot of this stuff to pick the one from 1938 that still works, works for us. So I did, as I found as a kid, I was born in 44, in the 50s, and when I saw the Marx Brothers, basically as a young teenager, they were funny to me, as was I Love Lucy. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it appealed actually to a juvenile aesthetic. And if I would look at that, I would say that is the aesthetic that it appealed to there, in that our the sense of humor and our idea about the comic. First of all, the sense of humor is a fairly recent concept. If you look at a Google Ngram and you look at the term sense of humor, you'll see it only really starts to occur in the 1860s. Before that, it's a sense of the ridiculous or a sense of ridicule. A sense of humor starts to mean something deeper and is important to us now, not simply because what we laugh at, but what we laugh with. And a sense of humor is somehow also the ability to cast yourself out and see yourself humorously. And that's relatively recent. And that's why Donald Trump, who's funny, does not have a sense of humor. And, one of the things I thought of here, which is it's not my thought, but what's the actual most important effect of our recent times ridicule? What is the most consequential effect? It's Obama's roast of Trump at the White House dinner.
Which is what stimulated Trump to run. That's interesting that it's definitely true that, say, Andrew Jackson, George Washington did not know of going somewhere, paying, and having somebody come out and make their diaphragm titter. That did not exist. And of course, there was such thing as laughter. People had jokes, but it wasn't about performance. And one thing is that starting in the early 1800s, the closest thing to a stand-up comedian was a clown. Circus clowns would come out and talk about the issues of the day and say funny things and then take a pie in the face or something like that. But the stand-up comedian doesn't really exist until the 20th century and not at the beginning of it. Well, no, that's an important point.
I think in vaudeville you have the monologue. You have something like that. You have jokes, you have material. And if you look at, as I did some research on it, like what are you going to do with the monologue? First of all, it's not a narrative. You're going to create a set of index cards where you're going to have essentially jokes. You're going to go, so you do have something like stand-up.
You mean in say even in say '05 or something like that, a monologue would be recognizable.
I think in the 1880s, 1890s, you already have, it's called just one person in front of a curtain.
Right.
And often this happens, like with Fred Allen and W.C. Fields, they're jugglers at the start.
Right. But they also say things.
Juggling, you drop things, you say funny things, but then material starts to get written. Material starts to get written and it starts to get bought. It starts to get bought and jokes get told. And there's all sorts of other kind of bits. There's one I saw, which essentially is things like, there was a comedian, Norm Crosby, whose whole act was malapropisms.
Right.
So here you will have something called the German senator. And what does it mean? He's German and he mangles language and he talks about the issues of the day. He gets all of the things a little bit mixed up. And so I actually was looking at some, you really can go down a rabbit hole.
Fascinating rabbit hole.
But all of it is so fascinating because of the history of it. Never so fascinating that I'd actually want to do the work of a historian. Let me make that clear, because that's hard. But it's there. It's all there. The history of you can go up now, you can see an Eddie Cantor routine from the 20s straight out of vaudeville where he's essentially doing stand-up. It's just one joke. It's one joke after other. It's different than when I was growing up. First of all, stand-up didn't exist as a term. There were comics.
Right.
Stand-up is actually a term. Google Ngram is great for this. You can go
Right.
look. Hey, when does the term actually? They're comics. They're on the Ed Sullivan Show, and the Ed Sullivan Show, of course, is vaudeville.
Right. Oh, complete. I mean,
Yeah.
no, I'm really thinking about these differences. You talk about comic. Old radio didn't have comics, and so even that. I know what you're talking about with the monologues, and I'm imagining that sort of thing where the person comes out in front of the curtain and they're a character, and they're like even Eddie Cantor and his character. I recommend something to this audience actually in terms of somebody coming out and making remarks about the issues of the day with a certain wry quality that we would recognize. There's a guy named Jack Osterman, and I think you can find it on YouTube, Osterman.
Yeah.
He's the guy who comes out and makes remarks, and you think to yourself, wow, this is like Seinfeld's great grandfather. And then Frank Fay was supposed to be somebody who started doing that.
Course, yeah.
But then also, folks, to get a sense of what Strike Up the Band actually looked like, and it's really lucky that we have this for something in 1930, the second version, there is also on YouTube this wonderful little 5-minute thing where somebody actually went backstage and they actually show Gershwin accompanying a rehearsal of the number Mademoiselle in New Rochelle with these two knockabout vaudeville comedians, Bobby Clark and Paul McCullough. And you get a look at what it looked like. And one thing is, Bob, that you listen to Bobby Clark. I never thought you could hear his voice until I saw this. Bobby Clark is sitting there with his painted on glasses, and you're wondering what's so funny. And he does his banter with Gershwin, which I'm sure was partly scripted. And you can see the tone of voice, like why those two people who in photographs look so hopelessly uninteresting were funny, because Bobby Clark's patter is actually entertaining. I highly recommend seeing that. But
well,
go ahead.
You're right, because I looked at some of these movies. You can see their talent. Okay. So much of the talent also is physical. They've learned it from vaudeville. It's
in
the
big houses,
embodiment of humor. Of course, there's Will Rogers also and Mark Twain. So there are people, you mentioned, Seinfeld, and Seinfeld's an interesting show because for me, it was a kind of perfect clockwork comedy. It's just but very different in that no one is breaking out of character to tell the joke.
Right.
And this is in that book where it's a question of, does it interrupt the narrative as gags do, or is it a part of the comic event?
Exactly. And that kind of thing takes time. But Strike Up the Band is something that I think we have established is a very interesting part of a historical timeline. And if we're thinking about a musical satire, now, frankly, a great many musicals have a satirical tone, and we think nothing of it. My favorite recently, if recently as 22 years ago, is Urinetown, which was a purely satirical musical set to great music, closed for chance reasons, but is now about to get a revival. But Strike Up the Band is the beginning of that tradition for the American musical in any substantial way. And it's set to music that is absolutely splendid. And in the next edition of this podcast, we're going to talk to Maestro John Mauceri, who conducted not one, but two recordings of Strike Up the Band, the 1927 version and the 1930. And so he knows not only milk, as the score says, but music. And so we're going to discuss the music in Strike Up the Band. But Bob, do you have any closing thoughts about this magnificently beautiful and also peculiar musical?
I really wish you would have had the chance to play Spelvin.
you could.
I'd be a great Spelvin, really.
Spelvin is the
I could
little...
even do the Nautch dance from Miss Draper if it came to
You can make up the Nautch dance.
It's been fun, and I guess tickets are available. I could actually see this if I wanted, right?
Something tells me that they will make sure that you see it. I
All
certainly intend to be there. That is this coming October 29th, folks. Strike Up the Band in a one-night performance with full orchestra and even fuller chorus conducted by Maestro Ted Sperling.
Thank you for listening to the Master Voices podcast. To learn more about Master Voices, visit mastervoices.org. You can discover our rich history, read chorus member spotlights, and buy tickets to upcoming performances. You can go there to support our work by making a tax-deductible donation. Your gift will allow us to continue our mission to spark greater human connections by reimagining what the choral experience can be. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.